Autumn is meant to be a season of rest, a gentle slowing of the world. When the fields sleep, the trees let go, and the last warmth slips from the earth. But not everything follows the season's rules. Some things do not rest. Some things do not wither. Some things wait, beneath bonfires, behind withered crops, under old orchards where the roots grow too deep. And every year, as the nights draw in, I receive new accounts from those who discover what refuses to die with the summer. These are the stories gathered for your listening. Please proceed with care. These are the autumn files.
The fields always look wrong when they're empty. All that neat gold stripped away, just black soil and broken stalks left behind. You spend half the year praying for dry days. Then when they finally come, there's nothing left to do but watch the land go still. Most nights I sit by the kitchen window with a mug of tea, listening to the wind move through the hedges. The dog lies by the stove, twitching in his sleep, and the house creaks like it's settling deeper into the cold. Out here you hear everything: the foxes, the owls, the distant hum of the grain dryer from the next farm over. That night I caught the first glimpse of them. Small lights, maybe half a mile away, sliding through the field where the wheat had been. I thought it was just the Evans boys, out lamping rabbits again, or maybe some kids with phones. But these didn't bounce or flicker like torches. They drifted, steady, slow, all at the same height, moving in a line. I watched them for maybe a minute before they sank out of sight behind the ridge. Didn't think much of it after that. Just autumn, I told myself. Long nights play tricks when there's nothing left growing and too much space to fill. But later, lying in bed, I could still see the glow behind my eyelids, soft, pale, like lanterns swinging in the wind. It was 3 nights later when I saw them again. I'd been out in the yard shutting the shed doors, trying to keep the damp off the tools, when the dog started growling low, that rumble that sits deep in his chest. I followed his stare out toward the bottom field. There they were, the same pale lights, gliding through the mist just above the ground. Only this time, there were more of them. 7, maybe 8. Drifting in a slow curve across the land. Too steady for flashlights, too even for lanterns. And not a sound. No footsteps, no talking. Just the wind and the faint rattle of dry stalks. I called out, something casual. "You lads out there again?" But my voice just vanished into the fog. Nothing called back. The dog's hackles went up and he barked once, sharp enough to make me flinch. That's when the lights stopped moving. They didn't fade, didn't turn, just stopped. Hung there, motionless in the dark. I stood watching until my breath turned to steam and my fingers went numb. Then the dog barked again and I shut the door. In the morning I went to look. The ground was slick with dew, but in the far field there were prints, deep, heavy, not quite boots. Each one packed with straw. Along the hedge, bits of old fabric had caught on the thorns. Torn burlap, some frayed rope. Looked like the stuffing of a scarecrow pulled apart by crows. I told myself that's all it was. But that night, when the dog refused to go outside, I couldn't stop staring through the glass, waiting for those lights to come back. By the next afternoon, I'd convinced myself it had all been nothing. The lights, the footprints, probably some kids playing around, or hunters using night scopes. The mind fills in gaps when it's dark and quiet long enough. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, moving through my fields while I slept. So I took the quad out after lunch to check the boundary fence. The sky had that washed-out autumn look, gray with streaks of pale sun. Wind carried the smell of smoke from someone burning stubble down the lane. Halfway along the back hedge, I saw it. A shape caught in the wire, half sunk into the soil. Looked like a bundle of rags at first, maybe an old coat. When I pulled it free, the head came apart in my hands, straw spilling out in clumps, twisted around bits of rusted metal. The arms were lashed together with rope, and something pale between them. Bone. Old and worn, pitted and cracked where scavengers had chewed them long ago. There was newspaper stuffed into the chest cavity, the print smudged but readable enough. Local harvest fair, 1979. 46 years ago. I stood there staring at it, the thing half collapsed across my boots, and felt my stomach go cold. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to build this. It wasn't just a scarecrow. It was something else. Something meant to look human and not quite get there. I hauled it to the edge of the field and set it on fire. The straw went fast, the bones slower, popping in the heat like damp wood. The wind carried the smell back toward me, sour and oily. By the time I got home, the light was fading. I was halfway through locking up when I saw them again, those faint orbs out in the dark. Only now they were closer, maybe 2 fields away. The wind picked up after midnight, scraping the last dry leaves along the yard. I was half asleep in the armchair, dog curled at my feet, when he jerked upright with a low growl that made the hairs rise on my arms. Then came the sound, a dull thud against the glass. Not loud, not sharp, just deliberate. One, then another. I got up and flicked on the outside light. The yard was a blur of mist and frost, the edges of the field lost in shadow. The dog pressed against my leg, low in his throat. At first I didn't see anything. Then the porch light caught something moving, a single piece of straw fluttering across the step. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying that smell again, damp earth and burnt hay. There were marks on the ground, like something had dragged across it, a dark streak leading back toward the field. I followed it to the fence, shining my torch out over the land. Nothing. Just rows of stubble and fog. But then the torch caught on movement, the briefest shimmer, like lights reflected off glass. And the noise that followed wasn't wind. It was a slow, dry rustling somewhere in the field, getting closer, then stopping. The dog barked once, sharp, and whatever it was went still. Then, from the darkness, came the faintest whisper of something brushing against the wire. A creak, a sigh, like a person shifting their weight, trying not to be seen. I stood there until my arm ached from holding the torch. Nothing moved again. No lights this time, just silence. Back inside, I bolted the door. First time I'd done that in years. When I went to bed, I could still hear it, that soft rustle of straw. Not out in the fields anymore, but somewhere nearer. By mid-afternoon the next day, I'd had enough of being afraid of my own land. The air was sharp but bright, the kind of light that makes everything look clean. Golden fields, blue sky, long black shadows stretching like cracks across the ground. Every time I stepped from shade into sun, it hit me in the eyes, dazzling white for a second before fading back to the dull colors of autumn. I took the quad down toward the far boundary, where the strip of corn still stood uncut. They didn't grow well in this area this year. The stalks were dry now, whispering together in the wind. I told myself I'd just look, just prove there was nothing there. Halfway in, the noise of the world faded. No birds, no engines, just the papery hiss of corn brushing my jacket. The light broke through in thin slats, and the shadows between them felt thicker than they should. The stalks opened into a clearing, and I saw them. 6, maybe 7 shapes built in a rough circle. Scarecrows, but not like any I'd ever made. The first was slumped forward, its spine made from barbed wire twisted around fence posts. The head was a rotted cow skull, jaw tied shut with twine. Another had half a doll's face nailed to a lump of wood, the eye socket stuffed with straw that hung out like hair. One was wrapped in a dead sheep's fleece, the wool gray and stiff, buzzing faintly with flies. Others were patched from sacks, rope, scraps of animal hide, and wads of newspaper stuffed into torn torsos. Each one bound to a stake, facing inward, as if watching something that used to stand in the middle. In that center space was a mound of fresh straw, darker where it had been dampened by something that looked too red to be rain. A coil of rope sat nearby, half buried in the soil. A footstep pressed down on dry leaves behind me. I turned, light flashing across the stalks, but saw only movement. A shape ducking low, slipping between rows, too fast for me to follow. The shadows closed in again, long fingers stretching from every stalk. By the time I stumbled back into open air, the light was already fading behind the trees. And when I looked back toward the field, I could still see them, those figures standing perfectly still, their shadows stretching all the way to my boots. That night the wind came back. It rattled the tin on the barn roof, whistled through the keyholes, set the gutters moaning. The dog wouldn't leave the kitchen, just lay there trembling, eyes fixed on the back door. I'd locked every bolt I could find, drawn the curtains, even wedged a chair under the handle like that would matter. The air inside the house felt tight, heavy with that same smell again, damp straw and earth, the scent that comes when something's been dug up after too long underground. Then came the first sound. Not a knock this time, more like a dragging, a soft scrape moving along the outside wall. The dog growled once, then went silent. I looked out through a slit in the curtain. The fields were alive with lights, dozens of them now, steady and pale, flickering behind the mist like lanterns carried by an invisible procession. They weren't moving fast, just drifting toward the house in slow, measured lines. My heart started hammering. I grabbed the torch and the old shotgun from above the hearth. Outside, the air hit me like ice. The yard looked wrong, straw scattered everywhere, forming faint trails leading toward the barn. The door was open, swinging slightly. I edged closer, torch shaking in my hand. Inside, the smell was unbearable, rot and metal. The beam caught on something tall in the center of the barn, a figure made of straw. Built from my own bales, lashed together with rope, wearing my spare coat and hat, my old boots nailed to the bottom. And in the middle of its chest, wedged deep into the straw, was my kitchen carving knife. The wind blew through a crack in the boards, and the whole thing swayed forward, creaking like it was breathing. Then the dog started barking again, not from the house but from outside. I turned, and the lights were closer now, forming a ring around the property. I ran back, shouting his name, but by the time I reached the porch, he'd gone quiet. The lanterns had stopped moving. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the hiss of wind through the grass. Then, from somewhere behind me, inside the house, came a dry rustling, like something shifting against wood. The smell hit me first, earth, smoke, and the sweet rot of straw. I turned toward the stairs, the torch beam shaking over the walls. That's when I heard the floorboards creak above me, slow and deliberate. And just before the light cut out, I saw something fall from the landing. A single stalk of straw, drifting through the air like ash. I should have never gone looking and minded my own business.
I came to the cottage in late October, after the last of the apples had fallen. My uncle had gone to stay with friends down south for a few weeks and wanted someone to keep an eye on the place. It was a small stone house tucked behind the village, a few crooked lanes away from the main road, with an orchard that sloped down toward a stream. I hadn't been here since I was a kid, but the smell hit me the same way it always had. Smoke, damp leaves, and that faint sweetness of rot that clings to fallen fruit. The village itself was quiet in that way countryside places get after harvest. Tractors locked away, hedges turning brown, windows glowing early. I went into the shop for milk and came out with the whole story before I'd even asked. My uncle's orchard hadn't been touched in years. No one picked the apples anymore. "They're not right," the woman behind the counter said, eyes on the floor. "Best leave them for the birds." I laughed it off, told her I'd just be staying a week or two, keeping the pipes from freezing. She didn't laugh back. The cottage was cold but clean. He'd left a note on the table, the usual list of instructions. Feed the cat if he comes by. The boiler's temperamental. Don't open the root cellar unless you have to. I skimmed it, made tea, and sat by the back window. The orchard filled the view. Rows of gnarled trees bending under their own weight, fruit still clinging in patches. Beneath them, a carpet of brown and red apples, half-rotted, buzzing faintly with flies. As the light went down, I heard them. A pair of cats somewhere out there, screeching and yowling the way cats do when they're testing who's braver. The sound echoed through the trees, sharp at first, then muffled, like it had gone underground. It stopped suddenly. I told myself it was nothing. Country nights were full of strange noises, and silence always felt worse afterward. Still, when I locked the door that night, I noticed the latch didn't fit quite right, like it had been bent from the outside. The next day passed easy. It was one of those rare late autumn days where the air feels clean again after rain. Sunlight thin, but bright enough to turn everything gold. I made coffee, fed the cat that appeared from nowhere, and wandered down through the orchard path with my coat unzipped, just listening to the wind move through the branches. The place was almost beautiful in daylight. I'd expected it to feel overgrown and claustrophobic, but it had that quiet, forgotten charm. Moss thick on the stone wall, little pools of water in the hollows of fallen apples. A few trees still carried fruit, small and bruised, but clinging stubbornly. When I brushed against one of the lower branches, a handful of apples dropped with soft thuds around my boots. It was peaceful. I was halfway back to the cottage when the stillness split apart. A single, sharp cry. The sound of cats fighting, all teeth and fury. Another followed, then a chorus that made my scalp prickle. The noises rose and tangled, echoing through the orchard in bursts. Underneath them was something heavier, a deeper note that didn't fit. Not quite a growl, but full-bodied, breath behind it. As I walked towards the noise, the atmosphere took on a thick, sweet smell. Each step crushed more fruit, releasing a syrupy stench that clung to the back of my throat. Moths, drawn from the fallen apples, fluttered up around my face, catching in my hair. When I switched on my torch, they came at the beam in soft, papery bursts, and other things moved too. Beetles, pale grubs, a cloud of gnats lifting like dust. The cries stopped all at once. Only the sound of insects and my own breathing remained. I pushed on another few steps, and my boot slid on something slick. The ground gave way underfoot, and I stumbled hard, catching myself on my hands. My palm landed on glass. A small bottle was half buried in the soil, its cork black with age, the neck caked in grime. The label clung to it in yellowed strips, and through the dirt I could just make out a few words. For the relief of nervous agitation. The bottle was cold, colder than the ground, colder than the air. I could feel it through the fabric of my glove. I left it where it was and stood up slowly, wiping my hand on my jeans. The orchard had gone quiet again. Not peaceful this time, just waiting. Morning brought a pale kind of calm. Mist hung low over the orchard, softening the shapes of the trees so they looked like old men standing with their heads bowed. Dew glittered on every surface, even the gate latch, cold and slick under my hand. I kept telling myself I'd imagined how cold that bottle had been, that the mind makes things worse in the dark. But I still found myself carrying a trowel and gloves when I went out after breakfast. The orchard smelled stronger in the daylight. Sweetness and rot mixed with damp earth and something sharper, almost medicinal. The flies were sluggish now, huddled in the shade of fallen fruit. But when I disturbed them, they rose in black swarms, the hum thick and steady like a wire under tension. I found the place easily enough. The slope below the crooked apple tree where the bottle had been. The soil looked disturbed, darker, as if the rain hadn't touched it. The bottle itself sat half out of the ground, exactly where I'd left it. I crouched, pried it loose, and brushed the dirt away. The label was clearer in daylight now, though the paper flaked under my thumb. Compound bromide and laudanum tonic, for the relief of nervous agitation, hysteria, and melancholia. Dose, 10 to 20, drops in water, nightly until calm is obtained. Manufactured by Dr. H.B. Lanton, Elm Hollow Dispensary, Devonshire, for external and internal distress. The lettering had been done by hand, not print. And under the label, the glass was etched with numbers, 0043, like part of a larger batch. I set the bottle aside and started digging. The soil crumbled easily, almost too dry for autumn. At barely a foot down, my trowel hit something solid with a dull thunk. Another bottle, then another. Some were cracked, others whole. All of them different shapes and sizes, but with the same kind of labels: tinctures, tonics, sedatives, cures for melancholy, hysteria, restlessness. Their corks had fused into the glass. I dug a little wider, and the earth yielded other things: rusted wire, shards of porcelain, something that might once have been the head of a doll, and a folded sheet of paper that broke apart when I tried to open it. Beneath the paper, a corner of color caught the light. It was a magazine, dry as if it had never been buried. The front read, "The British Journal of Psychological Medicine, April 1927. The adverts inside were almost beautiful in their own awful way. Perfect lettering, delicate ink drawings of smiling women and polite men. Reassure the restless wife. Administer 2 teaspoons of Barker's bromide compound nightly. A sound mind is a quiet mind. Use thermohydro restraints, now available in patient sizes. Dr. Kershaw's convulsive method. Cure melancholy with a shock of life." The ink hadn't faded. The paper didn't even smell of earth. Just that same faint tang of chemicals and fruit. The wind shifted. A single apple dropped beside me, heavy enough to splash soil up my sleeve. I startled harder than I should have. When I looked back down, the hole seemed deeper than before. The edges slumped inward, as though something beneath had given way. I told myself I'd had enough digging for one day, but as I walked back toward the cottage, the smell of those bottles clung to me, sweet and metallic, the scent of rot covered by something pretending to be clean. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape of that hole, dark, bottomless, ringed with broken glass and smiling faces from those adverts. By morning, I'd convinced myself to fill it in. Curiosity had its limits. The air was damp, colder than the day before, and the orchard looked different somehow, as if the trees had crept closer together overnight. Their branches tangled high above me, blotting out half the sky. The ground sucked at my boots, soft and uneven from where I'd dug. I knelt and began pushing soil back in, but the trowel struck something almost immediately. Not glass this time. Wood. I brushed the dirt aside and uncovered a small box. Cedar, maybe? its hinges eaten by rust. It came apart in my hands. Inside were small glass jars, neatly arranged in rows. Most were empty, but a few still held things. Teeth, tufts of gray hair, what looked like fingernails pressed into old cotton. Each jar had a label written in the same hand as the bottles. Patient number 17, restless. Patient number 23, prolonged agitation. Patient number 24, final dose. The soil around the box was darker, wetter. When I dug a little deeper, I found thin rods of metal, bent and corroded, ending in blunt prongs. Surgical tools, maybe, though rougher than anything medical. Some still had straps attached, leather stiff as bark. The smell rising from the hole turned my stomach. Apples and something sour, layered with the stinging reek of disinfectant, the kind that clings to your skin no matter how much you wash. I sat back on my heels, breathing through my sleeve, and realized the orchard had gone silent again. Not quiet, silent. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of the stream. The trees stood perfectly still, and for a moment, I had the insane idea that they were listening. Then came a sound from below, faint, wet, like soil settling. But it wasn't settling. It was moving. A bubble rose through the dirt, popped with a small hiss. Another followed, then another. The earth shifted as though something beneath it was breathing. I stumbled to my feet, dropped the trowel, and backed away. The ground inside the hole pulsed once, a slow lift, then collapse, and the smell hit me full force. Sweet, heavy, rotten to the core. I didn't go back for the trowel. By the time I reached the cottage door, the mist had rolled in thick from the stream. It swallowed the orchard whole behind me. That night, the cat didn't come to the window, but I could hear something moving out there. A low, rhythmic sound, like glass knocking softly together beneath the soil. Sometime in the night, a crash jolted me awake. It wasn't a scream or a voice, just the kind of solid, heavy thud that makes the walls tremble for a second and then leaves you listening to your own heartbeat. Outside, the cats were at it again, their yowling rising and breaking, echoing through the orchard like a chorus of metal scraping glass. I almost went to the window, but stopped halfway across the room. The sound had a rhythm to it this time, not fighting, but calling. One cat mewing, the others answering, the noise bouncing back and forth until it faded into the wind. After that, only silence. When morning came, mist hung low enough to blur the hedges. The crash, I realized, had come from the orchard. One of the trees had fallen. It wasn't the oldest or the tallest, just a middle-aged apple tree near the slope I'd been digging. The whole thing had gone over at the roots, leaving a broad, dark wound in the ground. The bark was split clean down the trunk, and the exposed wood underneath was black and soft, riddled with holes like rot had been eating it from the inside for years. A sour chemical smell drifted from the hollow, sweet at first, then stinging at the back of the throat. The soil beneath the roots wasn't just soil. The collapse had opened a shallow pit lined with scraps of wood and metal. Shards of glass glittered among them, bottles like the ones I'd found before, along with heavier shapes. Rusted restraints, thick belts with buckles, something that might once have been a chair leg bolted to iron rings. I knelt beside the hole and brushed away some of the loose dirt. Under the first layer of debris were squares of tile, broken white enamel, bits of pipe, a section of a wall, maybe, and printed faintly on one of the tiles, half obscured by mud, Elm Hollow Sanatorium. I stared at it until the letters blurred. The name on the bottle label, Dr. H.B. Lanton, Elm Hollow Dispensary, slotted into place like a lock clicking shut. The orchard hadn't grown over an old asylum. It had been planted on top of it. I backed away, breath clouding in the cold air. The fallen tree groaned faintly as the wind shifted, branches moving like fingers. For a moment, I thought I heard the faint clink of glass under the earth again. Just once, clear and bright. Then the sound stopped, and the orchard went still. I didn't pack. Not yet. I told myself I'd leave in the morning when the sun was up and I could see the road clearly. But I couldn't bring myself to go back out there, not while the air still smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet soil. So I did what people do when they're trying not to think. I shut every curtain, turned on every lamp, and made noise. The old television in the corner, a stack of DVDs my uncle kept in a drawer. I played them loud, one after another, until the dialogue and laughter blurred together. If the cats started again, I didn't want to hear them. Between films, I opened my laptop. The signal was poor, the kind that stutters and freezes, but it was enough. I typed Elm Hollow Sanatorium and waited. It took a while to find anything beyond property records and vague local history. Then an old newspaper scan appeared, edges of the page still visible, the ink uneven where the paper had wrinkled. Elm Hollow Sanatorium to close following scandal. February 1933. The article was short, but every line felt heavier than the one before. 2 patients dead in a single week, another missing. The superintendent, Dr. Henry B. Lanton, accused of experimental sedation and improper administration of narcotics. It described something called fresh air therapy. Patients were restrained to posts in the orchard at night to steady the nerves. Sedatives were administered in varying doses, bromide mixtures, laudanum, ether inhalants, to keep them compliant. When they were lucid enough, staff were instructed to feed them fresh apples to restore vitality. When the authorities arrived, they found the orchard floor newly turned. Several patients were missing. Others were discovered emaciated, still bound to their restraints. The report noted, deceased individuals located between the root systems of multiple trees, remains partially integrated with surrounding growth. One inspector described it simply. The orchard had begun to feed. Dr. Lanton died 2 months later, before the trial could begin. The land was sold soon after. The signal cut out before I could scroll further, but I didn't need to. It explained everything and nothing at all. I turned the volume higher. The house glowed in its own little island of yellow light, surrounded by black windows and the faint hiss of wind. I stayed on the sofa all night, eyes half closed, listening to the television voices fill the space so the silence couldn't get in. Sometime between 2 and 3, the lights flickered once, a quick pulse, like the power dipping. And in that heartbeat of darkness, I thought I heard it again. A soft, wet clink of glass, bottles brushing together somewhere under the floor. When the screen came back, everything was quiet. I turned the volume up louder, just in case. Dawn came gray and silent. The power had gone off sometime before morning. The television dead, the lamps dark. Only the faintest stripe of light slipped between the curtains. The air in the cottage felt heavier, damp with that same scent of turned soil. I packed in silence. Just a few things. Clothes, phone, keys. The rest could stay. I didn't look out the back window until I was ready to leave. When I did, mist was rolling across the orchard, slow and pale, each tree half hidden in it, like they'd stepped forward a little during the night. When I opened the front door, something clinked against it. A bottle stood neatly on the porch step, beaded with dew. The wax seal was cracked, the label clean and perfectly legible. Dr. Lanton's obedience mixture. For the regulation of the excitable wife, the melancholic child, and the overwrought servant, a calming tonic. Dose as required until submission is achieved. Elm Hollow Dispensary, Devonshire. Underneath it, a folded paper rested on the damp stone. The ink was fresh enough to bleed at the edges. Prescription patient, Elizabeth Russell. Symptoms: sleeplessness, curiosity, disturbance of temper. Treatment: 1 dose nightly, or until calm is obtained. H.B. Lanton, M.D. I don't remember picking it up, only the cold of the glass through my glove, and the way the liquid inside moved when I tilted it. Slow, thick, a faint chemical smell under the sweetness. Something creaked then. A long, low sound. Wood, under strain. I looked up. The nearest tree swayed slightly, though there was no wind. The bark along its trunk rippled faintly, as if the wood was breathing. The paper fluttered from my hand. I left the bottle on the step and walked to the car without looking back. The road out of the village was empty, lined with trees that all leaned the same way, their branches heavy with fruit too dark to be read.
Every village has its way of marking the end of autumn. Here, it's the bonfire. Always the same field, the same night, the same excuses. Old wood to clear, a bit of fun for the kids before the cold settles in for good. I'd been helping with it since I was young enough to roast marshmallows on a stick. Back then, the fire looked taller than a house. Now it barely reached my shoulders, but the smell of smoke and cider still made it feel right. The council never really organized it, not officially. It was the people who lived here, families who'd been around for generations, and those of us stubborn enough to stay. A few of us volunteered each year to get the thing started, ferrying trailers of scrap from gardens and farms to the field behind the church. By the end of October, every lane seemed to echo with the sound of wood being dragged, nails squealing as old sheds came apart. Anything went in the pile. Broken chairs, fence posts, bits of pallet wood. Someone dumped half a wardrobe one morning, the mirror still attached and spiderwebbed with cracks. It was the Evans kids who first mentioned the house. They were leaning on the gate, drinking hot chocolate from a flask, watching me and Tom stack pallets. "There's loads of wood up at the Hollow place," one of them said. "Proper dry, just lying there. No one lives there anymore." Tom made a face. "That wreck by the quarry? You'll give yourself tetanus just breathing in there." But they were grinning, that teenage grin that means we've already been. They told us the front door had fallen off its hinges, and the whole back wall was gone, so you could just walk in. The inside smelled like matches in hospitals. They'd already pulled off some wall panels, thick with old paint, and dumped them by the gate. I told them not to go back. It wasn't safe, but they shrugged. "Everyone's taking stuff for the bonfire," one said. "It's just wood." By the end of the week, a few more people had dropped off their share from the same place. Boards, beams, whole window frames still nailed together. The pile grew higher, darker. The older ones said it was the best we'd built in years. When I walked past it that night, the air smelled faintly chemical, like burnt polish. The moon was low, catching on the nails jutting from the boards so they glinted like tiny eyes in the dark. I wasn't supposed to go, but I did. Curiosity, I guess, or the kind of guilt that comes when you tell people not to do something, and then can't stop wondering why they wanted to. The Hollow House sat a mile out of the village, half swallowed by nettles and ivy. You wouldn't notice it from the road unless you knew where to look. The roof had folded in on itself years ago, and most of the windows were blind with grime. Even the birds avoided it. The boys were already there when I arrived. Their bikes leaned against the gate, music tinny from someone's phone. "See?" one called, waving a crowbar like a trophy. "Perfect wood, dry as bone." He wasn't wrong. The interior looked like someone had started to renovate 50 years ago, and then given up. Floorboards stacked in corners, sheets covering furniture that sagged in on itself. Wallpaper peeling in long curls from the damp plaster. The smell hit hardest. A mix of dust, soot, and that faint sourness that comes from things that used to be alive. I told them to leave anything that looked like it might collapse. They nodded, then went back to prying nails loose, the boards screeching as they came free. While they worked, I wandered through the rooms. The air was colder than outside, though shafts of light cut through the roof gaps. It felt like walking through a skeleton, every sound hollow, every surface brittle. In what must have been the parlor, the fireplace was filled with soot and feathers, as if something had tried to nest there and died. Above the mantel hung a mirror blackened with age, its surface mottled so badly it reflected the room like a dream half-remembered. One of the lads called me over to the back door. "Check this out!" He'd pulled up a section of flooring that opened onto a shallow crawl space. A pile of junk lay below, shoes, jam jars, a doll missing its face. Something glinted among them, a bundle of tin cans strung together with wire, as though someone had tried to make a warning rattle. The air beneath was damp and cold. A smell of burnt oil lingered, faint but sharp. Someone muttered, "Creepy as hell." We filled the trailer anyway. Old doors, planks, bits of skirting board, anything that would burn. By the time we were done, the sky had turned the color of pewter and the first drops of rain had started to fall. As we left, one of the boys swore he saw light in the upstairs window. A faint flicker, too slow for lightning. We laughed it off, all of us too old to admit it made us walk faster. When we got back to the village, we dumped the load at the field. The smell of that house stayed on my clothes. Smoke, mold, and something faintly metallic, like rusted coins held too long in the hand. By the end of the week, the pile was taller than a van. From the road, it looked almost beautiful. A crooked tower of doors and beams stacked in neat chaos. Kids stopped on their way home from school to stare, trying to guess how high it would burn. We built it in the same field we always used, flat ground bordered by the stream on one side and the hedgerow on the other. The smell of wet grass mixed with the sharp tang of creosote and old timber. Every few minutes another car would pull up, boots creaking under new donations, bits of fencing, broken shelves, even a piano frame someone swore would make a great noise when it goes. Tom whistled low as we hauled it onto the pile. Looks like half the village wanted to get rid of their sins this year. It wasn't just the size. The color of the wood looked wrong too. Some of the boards from the hollow house had soaked up something dark, patches of oil or varnish that never seemed to dry. When the sun hit them, the sheen wasn't brown or black, but greenish, like pond water. I mentioned it to one of the committee lads. He shrugged. Old houses used weird stuff, creosote, arsenic paint, whatever. Just means it'll burn hotter. That evening we did a test burn, just a small pile of offcuts to see how the smoke would travel. The air was still, the fire caught quick. For a few seconds the flames glowed the usual orange, then shifted, a strange bluish tint, like gas. The smell that came off it wasn't wood. It was sweet, chemical, almost like melted wax. A few of us joked about it. Someone said it smelled like fireworks. But one of the older women from the village turned away, pressing a scarf over her mouth. By the time the light faded, we'd fenced the area off and set up the barrels for cider and sparklers. The fire stood dark and patient in the center, taller than any of us, its outline against the dusk like a giant waiting to move. As I locked the gate for the night, a gust of wind rattled through the pile. For a moment, the boards shifted against each other, a dry creak, deep and low, the sound of something exhaling. Bonfire Night arrived with a thin drizzle and the smell of fireworks already drifting in from the next village. By 7 o'clock the field was full, families in wellies, kids waving sparklers, old men with paper cups of cider. The fire towered in the middle, streaked dark with rain but still impressive, its surface glistening like wet bark. Someone played music through a speaker that kept cutting out, but nobody cared. It was the one night a year where the whole village seemed to breathe together. You could feel the crowd's warmth in your bones, that low hum of chatter, laughter, boots squelching in the mud. When Tom climbed up to light the base, people cheered. The first flare caught easily, crackling under the damp wood. Smoke rolled out in pale ribbons, carrying that familiar smell of burnt paint and resin. The fire spread quick, climbing the heap in rippling waves. Then the color changed. The flames thickened into a strange, uneven green, like copper burning too hot. Smoke turned black and heavy, pressing down instead of rising. The air tasted sweet. Sickly sweet, like singed sugar and something underneath it, metallic and sour. Children cheered anyway. A few adults clapped, half drunk on cider, but as the wind shifted, the smell rolled through the crowd, and people began to cough. The smoke stung the eyes, left a bitter film on the tongue. Tom shouted something I couldn't hear. The speaker cut off. The noise of the fire deepened, no longer crackling, but groaning, like beams snapping inside it. A pulse went through the flames, a low vibration that rattled in the chest. Then came the sound. At first it was just wood popping, but it grew, stretched until it wasn't quite that anymore. It became a long, drawn-out wail that rose above the wind and didn't stop. People started laughing nervously, then stopped when it didn't fade. It sounded too human, too deep. The crowd shifted back. Parents pulled their kids close. Someone yelled to get water, someone else to call the fire brigade, but the fire wasn't spreading. It wasn't even growing. It was holding, a fixed column of green flame that shuddered like it was breathing. And beneath the roar, I could hear something else. A rhythmic knocking, faint but steady, like wood striking wood from deep inside the pile. When the first board split open, the sound changed again, a gasp, sharp and sudden, swallowed by the heat. That's when people started to run. The wind turned hard and fast, carrying sparks across the crowd. People bolted in every direction, kids crying, dogs snapping at leads. The air thickened with smoke so dense it clung to clothes, hair, skin. The color had gone entirely now. The fire burned almost white in the center, edged with that sickly green like bruised light. Someone shouted for the fire brigade, but the signal out here was always patchy. Others tried with buckets, but the water only hissed and vanished before it touched the flames. The fire wasn't spreading. It wasn't consuming. It was boiling, rolling in on itself like something alive. I caught sight of Tom through the smoke. He was on his knees near the barrier, coughing into his sleeve. I ran to him, pulling him up, and together we backed toward the edge of the field. My throat felt raw, the taste metallic, almost bloody. The sound from the fire changed again, not the long wail from before, but shorter bursts, cracking, stuttering, almost like voices. Each one carried a shape. Not words exactly, but patterns of breath, gasps, as if the air inside the pile was exhaling different people at once. A board shot outward, landing close enough that the mud sizzled. The light flared higher, throwing moving shapes onto the hedges, arms, torsos, heads, all flickering, stretching, collapsing back into flame. When the fire engine finally arrived, the first blast of water hit with a scream like metal shearing. The jet hissed and split into steam. The firefighters shouted to each other, moving closer, but even from where I stood, I could see how wrong it looked. The water vanished the instant it touched the fire, as if it was being drunk. It took nearly half an hour before the flames began to shrink. When they did, it was sudden. The sound cut off mid-wail, leaving nothing but the hiss of steam and the ticking of metal. The smoke didn't rise. It folded back into the ground, sinking through the ash. Someone asked if anyone had been inside the pile, a child, maybe, or one of the lads messing about. We checked, counted, argued, but no one was missing. Still, people kept looking at each other, eyes watering from the smoke and fear. By the time the last embers died, the crowd had thinned to almost nothing. The field looked oddly clean, no smoldering heap, no half-burnt boards. Just a wide patch of black soil shining wet in the torchlight. The firefighters said the rain must have soaked through underneath, starving the base of air. It made sense. It had to. But as I left, boots squelching through the mud, I looked back one last time. The center of the scorched patch pulsed faintly, as if heat still moved under the surface. And for a second, just one, the earth breathed out a single curl of pale smoke. By morning, the field still smoked. The drizzle had returned, turning the soil slick and black, and the air hung thick with that syrup-sweet, metallic smell. A few of us came back early to check the damage, more out of habit than curiosity. The firefighters had already gone. They'd been polite but baffled. One of them told me creosote or varnish can cause flashpoints, burning hotter than petrol and repelling water. Old timber, old paints, half of them were toxic, he said. Could explain the color. He sounded certain, but his eyes kept drifting toward the scorched patch like he was trying to convince himself. The ground where the bonfire had been wasn't ash. It was glazed. A thin crust shimmered like bottle glass, cracked in long webs where the heat had cooled too fast. Beneath it, the mud steamed gently, breathing out in little sighs. At the center lay a heap of warped boards fused together. When I crouched to look, one of them flaked apart, revealing a scrap of wallpaper sealed inside, a vintage design of stylized apple trees, the leaves printed in pale green and gold. The edges were scorched, but the middle was perfect, untouched by flame. Someone beside me muttered, "House must have had some kind of preservative in the walls." Another suggested phosphorus paint, the kind used before the war. Everyone nodded quickly, grateful for an explanation that didn't involve imagination. While they talked, I noticed a small metal plaque half buried near the roots of the old fence post. I pried it loose with a stick. The engraving was warped, but legible. Hollow House, property of E. Lanton and Company. Industrial supplies. I didn't know the name. It could have been anyone's, a manufacturer, a builder, a long-gone landlord. Still, the letters looked new against the blackened soil, as if the fire had cleaned them instead of burning them. The wind shifted then, carrying a faint hiss from the scorched earth. Not quite smoke, not quite steam. It rose in thin white threads, twisting together before fading into the drizzle. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. "Let's get a pint," he said. I pocketed the plaque without knowing why, and followed him toward the road. Halfway up the hill, I looked back. The field was empty now, just a dark circle in the grass. For a heartbeat, a spark flickered at its center, small, bright, green, then sank out of sight.
Autumn is supposed to be the end of things, but some things don't end, they wait. If you walk home tonight, stay on the path. If you smell apples, smoke, or something sweet you can't quite place, keep moving.